everyone. My name is Bryn, and Caitlin, Rashida, and I will be presenting on the human dimensions of landscape ecology by doing a case study on the Coeur d'Alene Tribe's Wetland Program Plan. We believe that integrating Indigenous knowledge into the study of and protection of Earth's landscapes is essential. This past summer, I had the opportunity to work alongside the tribe and Dr. Majeka Sullivan, who you'll hear from later, on his project which is working alongside the tribe to monitor wetland restoration and in order to mitigate drought and promote the restoration of culturally relevant plant and wildlife species. Here are just a few of the stunning pictures that were taken during my time out in Idaho. So upon European settlement, a lot of unsustainable forestry, agriculture, mining, and beaver trapping occurred in surrounding areas, which has led to a 65% wetland loss on tribal land. And the tribe put out this statement of purpose for wetland restoration. And the main goal of this project is to restore wetlands in order to mitigate drought, to enhance fish habitat and culturally relevant plants and wildlife, and to improve the cultural services that the wetlands once provided. Now I'll talk a little bit about the landscape heterogeneity. So this image was produced by a team member, and it does a great job of highlighting some of these culturally important species, such as the Shiras moose, the American beaver, and the red band trout, the water potato, and several others. And some of these ecosystem services that the wetlands provide, such as drought mitigation services. So the diagram does a good job of depicting the heterogeneity as the landscape of northern Idaho is a complex landscape of mountain streams and riparian zones. And when these wetlands are in their healthiest state, they're highly diverse and home to many species. And so the complexity of the landscape from beaver dams and geomorphology enhances the cultural services from plant and wildlife species, such as the camas plant and salmon, which are foundational species to the tribe.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Meadows, and I'm excited to talk a little bit about the research tools that were used in this project. So the first research tool and the most important that I want to talk about is transects and quadrat surveys. So these are used to sample vegetation, which is kind of the focus of this project. So it's looking at native plant species that are of cultural and ecological significance to the nearby tribe. So that's kind of the focus of this project. However, because they're interested in these entire landscapes and the wetland ecosystem, there's a lot of components that they wanted to look at. So additionally, they did trail cameras for wildlife tracking, which is shown there on the right. If you're not familiar with the trail cameras, they just essentially show us in real time what kind of wildlife is going by. They also did bankful, flood-prone, sinuosity, and pebble count techniques to account for the stream geomorphology. This tells them a little bit about nearby streams and the water systems as a whole, and how they're functioning, how to best protect them. They also did water quality surveys to tell us about pollution as a potential threat and other aspects of the water quality that may be affecting the wetland ecosystems. And just because I kind of glossed over it there, if you're not familiar with quadrat sampling and transect sampling, those are pictured down on the left. So a quadrat essentially is just taking some measurement, a square shape, and you can just sample everything within that quadrat. And then sampling along a transect is a very similar technique, but instead of using a specific square that you're looking at, you're instead looking along a certain measurement. So like along a line in this case. This is a copy of the wetland assessment that actually came from their restoration plan. So it gives a little bit of information about what was important to them and what the kind of focuses were as they were going through and trying to come up with plans for restoration. So you can see there just some kind of general information about the wetland, as well as some wildlife documentation as far as what's nearby. They also go into specifics about the restoration, things that they might see to be obstacles to the restoration, or maybe specific approaches that would best kind of prioritize the ecological diversity in that area. So I organized it kind of weird just to maximize space there, but you can see lots of really interesting things that go into um, how they come up with these strategies and plans for wetland restoration and protection. And then, of course, plants were kind of the focus of this project, so I wanted to include this. They did go into other taxa as well, like specifically reptiles, amphibians, and big game species. They were nearby, but I did want to kind of highlight the native wetland plant species since that was the focus, and just show how they did this. So essentially, for this, they just went through and checked it if it was present in the wetland. So I thought that was kind of a cool little thing to just feature and show everybody about how they went about coming up with the strategies for the wetland protection using the research tools that they did. Thanks.
So, for the Coeur d'Alene tribe, the environmental, ecological, and cultural functions and values of the wetlands is something that they hold sacred, and they have forever depended on the unique plants and animals found within the reservation wetland sites since time immemorial. The wetlands also are critical for the very survival of the Coeur d'Alene people who traditionally have known to derive much of their sustenance when it comes to even shelter from the wetland flora and fauna. So the population, even though of all of their culturally important flora and fauna have been declining, the people, however, of the Coeur d'Alene tribe continue to utilize as many of the species that do remain, and obviously being hopeful for the much of the culturally important species to being restored for future generations to also make use of and cherish. So the Coeur d'Alene tribe has thereby been involved with the reservation wetland activities in varying degrees and varying forms for many, many decades. The tribe has also formed a wetland work group, which was initially comprised of employees from several tribal departments, and that included natural resources, land services, and culture programs, lake management, obviously more on the information technology side, so GIS technical expertise that was required, and also from the public work departments. And so what was interesting was that the inputs, therefore, from this very interdisciplinary group um, that they formed greatly helped and thereby facilitated the development of the many goals, actions, and the activities that were thereby described within the wetland program plan. So, the Coeur d'Alene tribe's monitoring and assessment efforts also that formed the basis and would essentially form the basis of successful tribal wetland program plan, establishing a solid foundation from which other core elements can be built upon by providing some sort of a baseline data on wetland condition, extent, function, and values. In order to go in that direction, the tribe recommended a sort of a wetland classification system for the tribes that identified even the wetland characteristics that were culturally important for the tribe.
Next up, we will hear from our expert interviewee, who is Dr. Majeka Sullivan. He's the director of the Baruch Institute of Coastal Ecology and Forest Science, and he has a background in Native American studies, biology, and natural resources. He also conducts research out of the Strive Lab, which stands for Streams, Rivers, and Estuaries, which is out of the Baruch Institute. In addition to the project that he's working on with wetland restoration in the Coeur d'Alene tribe, he also works on Coeur d'Alene tribe's water rights and justice. So we really found his interview very valuable, and we hope you do as well. If you wouldn't mind just like introducing yourself and the project a little bit.
Absolutely. So it is I think, a very exciting project. We're working for the Coeur d'Alene tribe, project that's funded separately, but it's in collaboration with the Coeur d'Alene tribe. My undergrad degrees are and one of my majors is Native American studies, and so I had a lot of exposure to um, these issues, which were always very interesting to me and very important. And so I think this is a nice way to be able to bring the science into that and to think about the implications of a changing landscape. So, yeah, it's a very, as Brendan, as you found out this summer, it's a very exciting project, and I think it's very complex, but it's also very meaningful both to the tribe and to the scientists in terms of making on the ground differences. So we are working in northern Idaho and mostly on the Coeur d'Alene Reservation. Waterways drain Lake Coeur d'Alene, which is a beautiful lake, and also many other smaller waterways and so forth. So it's a really resource-rich area.
What are the goals of the project? Like, what is the focal conservation or the human well-being values or goals associated with the project?
This project is pretty fascinating in that way because the Coeur d'Alene tribe, as a as a user of the natural resources for millennia, are key pieces of the puzzle here. And we think about management and conservation around these issues. The Coeur d'Alene tribe is a major part of that. I used to live in Idaho. I've worked with the Coeur d'Alene tribe before. I know the folks well, or many, a lot of them. And it's a really meaningful project in that sense. In terms of the major goals of the project, it's a multifaceted project. One of the key goals is understanding the landscapes. And these landscapes, what I mean is I'm talking about really riverscapes, so rivers and lakes and streams and the associated uplands that are linked to them. But how are all these distributed across the landscape? How are they protected? Are they protected properly? Are they providing the services? There's multiple avenues of this project. One of the key avenues is understanding how changes in aquatic landscapes, these aquascapes, I suppose, but would over time, how those changes translate to changes in the beneficial uses of the tribe. And so a lot of the work that we are focusing on, well, one is waterfowl and birds, and the other, of course, is plants. So those are both key areas that are important to the tribe. They're important to the natural resources. They're important to the ecology of the region.
Could you go into the spatial and temporal scales that you work with?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's multiple scales we're sort of dealing with. One is the Coeur d'Alene tribe and the use of waterfowl, plants, and so forth. And that has a very long history, right? So we're talking about thousands of years. These systems provide beneficial uses. They provide food. They provide a lot of really important ecosystem services for the tribe. Now that's changed a little bit, but the basis of those are the same, right? So we try to understand that there's change in management, there's change in the population, there's change in the landscape, there's all sorts of changes. There's environmental changes and so forth. And so those changes are important as well. And we try to understand how those environmental changes affect beneficial uses for the tribe as well.
I have a question, if that's all right. I know Bren is probably familiar with the landscape out there pretty well, but for those of us who haven't been out there, could you describe the landscape of the area a little bit? Maybe touch on its like heterogeneity a little bit?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's a landscape. It's a beautiful area, and we are obviously focused on these river systems and lake systems. So, yeah, these systems, these areas were the traditional homeland of the Coeur d'Alene, where they gathered and hunted, fished, and maintained their livelihoods. And a lot of that was based on sort of seasonal cycles, and so they would move around and incorporate the landscape and all its benefits of the annual cycle. Now with Europeans and so forth arriving, that shifted that, and there was there was I don't know how much detail you need here, but essentially that both tribes were confined to reservations, and these reservations were much smaller parcels of land, living on much smaller parcels of land than they did historically. So that caused a lot of change, both social change, both um, change to the cultural changes.
You kind of briefly touched on some of the human impacts that have changed the land, but could you dig in a little bit more into how European settlement might have or definitely has impacted these lands?
A lot of what happened was that there was so much change so quickly that a lot of pieces shifted, and so you had a lot of the forests being you had forestry coming in, so you had a lot of the forest changed, altered, which really altered the whole fabric and the nature of the watersheds. You had the effects of agriculture. And so when you start adding up all these changes over time, when you start adding up population increases, you can see how that could play out in a major way over time.
Yeah, so we were kind of just wondering, so we've done some talking in this class and some others about kind of stakeholders and like collaborating organizations. And we were just kind of wondering on this project, are there any collaborators or any like important stakeholders or anybody that you feel is kind of important to this project?
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of different folks involved, and obviously one of the main partners there is the Coeur d'Alene tribe, right? And so that's a really critical. I can't stress that enough because that's really why we're doing this. So, but there's groups that represent local conservation and similar organizations that are on the ground, really interested in wanting to know what we find out.
How the wetland characteristics were identified that were culturally important to the tribe.
And what we wanted to do was be able to identify wetland characteristics that would be meaningful from an ecological, natural resource standpoint, but also from a spiritual, cultural, and economic standpoint.
This concludes our presentation on the human dimensions of landscape ecology by looking at the Coeur d'Alene Tribe's Wetland Program Plan. And in conclusion, humans have had long-lasting impacts on our landscape and environment, and along with human development, we must examine the consequences that follow our actions. And we believe that exploring Indigenous knowledge is an important pathway to learn about better ways to protect and preserve our natural lands and landscapes.